Welcome to Beyond the Things Written. And for today's episode, I have to do a brief intro and a brief warning. Today's episode may cause drowsiness. Please do not listen to this while operating a motor vehicle, because today we tackle Jehovah's Witnesses and Bible chronology, or melatonin, a nice sleep aid. Up next on Beyond the Things Written. Okay, so when we're getting into biblical chronology, particularly Jehovah's Witness chronology, it's taken primarily from the Millerites. Now, we can trace it back further, which we will do. Today, let's get an overall view of the original chronology. And it starts with the numbers in the Bible that are taken from Daniel. Daniel has 4 numbers that are taken often prophetically with these type of groups, Jehovah's Witnesses being one of them. So they start off when Daniel talks about 4 numbers: 1,260 days, 1,290 days, to 1,335 days, and to 2,300 days. And then they take a day for a year. Okay? And basically all you do is you shift the starting points to line it up to your time period. And this is what they've been doing for a very long time. So when Jehovah's Witnesses chronology came along in Russell's time, they had basically taken new starting points from the original Millerite chronology and just moved them so they lined up nicely in their time period. So it was very close. Then we have another separate set of time periods, but they're not days specifically mentioned in the Bible. But people are calculating the time periods. For instance, the Gentile times, right? The scripture in Luke, but also in Leviticus, where they get the idea of a certain time period called the Gentile times. And they link it up then with 2,520 days. This Gentile times is something that Jehovah's Witnesses had borrowed already from other groups. And then you have something called Earth's Jubilee, which figured prominently in the Jehovah's Witness chronology. You have something called Israel's Double, which is a period of 1,845 years. You have the end of 6,000 years, which, according to the Time Is At Handbook, by the way, everything I'm saying today is from the Time Is At Handbook. I'm using this issue that I got here with my big green one, where I got you have to study with Bible students to get them. But anyways, that's where I'm getting all this info. So if you hear something strange, that's where I'm getting it from. So the end of 6,000 years. The reason why I'm mentioning that is because a lot of people get this one wrong. It's not 1874. It's 1872 that the end of 6,000 years. And so oftentimes you will see 1873. And that is one thing, too, that's a little confusing about the chronologies. You will see different numbers. You will see 1914, 1915, depending on the edition. You'll see on Barber's chronology in the 3 worlds, he'll mention 75 when it kind of means 74, but because it started in 74, it's hard to figure out all the things that they mean because they do have different editions. Sometimes I used to think that the plates, meaning the printing plates, could have made errors on them, but evidently these editions do have changes. So we have this collection of biblical chronology. We have the numbers and the years, right? 1260, 1290, 1335, 2300. That's one thing. Then we have times of the Gentiles, Earth's Jubilee, the times of restitution, and Israel's double. See? Simple. Just like that. We've got it. That's the basic components of the original chronology. There's more to it. So you add to that parallelisms. This was prominent too along with what they considered extra confirmation that this is too extraordinary to be denied, and that was parallelisms. And they continued this after as well with Rutherford's chronology. If something happened for a certain time in the first century, for some reason, you take that and you just apply it to your years. So if Jesus did something and then you count 3.5 years, like he cleansed the temple, 3.5 years later, depending, it sounds ridiculous. But then you apply it to the dates that you've come up with, and then you do 3.5 years from there. And then they keep doing this. They extend it even further. So I'll show you how this is done. So first, then we have the parallelisms. And then we have the coup de grace. The one that is swept under the table the most by Jehovah's Witnesses today. And that is the Great Pyramid of Giza. The Great Pyramid had not a day for a year, an inch for a year. And they have a whole system of corroborating all the exact points that we're going to discuss in a second. So, brief review. We have the four numbers, 1260, 1290, 1335, and 2300. We have these prophetic time periods, Gentile times, times of restitution, Earth's Jubilee, Israel's double. Right? Was that 8 things? I think it's kind of 8 things. And within that, you have parallelisms and the Great Pyramid, all confirming God's chronology, God's timetable as it was described in Russell's day. God's due time, as he often called it. God's due time. Okay, now let's get into the details. Without getting into too much detail, we'll go over the numbers. So 1260, that goes to 1799. This has a backstory going into the 18th century, which a prediction made by George Bell and a fellow named Finley. It has to do with the Pope and the papacy and how it was removed by Napoleon during the war. Of course, this was huge at the time, as extraordinary as any event that's happened in those times since. One of the, and certainly you could see biblical expositors thinking, especially Protestant ones, right? Oh, the papacy is removed. That's what the sort of an anchor date became, is this was predicted before it happened. And so groups like the Millerites would get into this. And of course, that would lead to Russell. So we have 1799 is 1260. And all we got to do is keep counting. So they had an anchor date. The Pope took power, or the papacy, right, took power. And you just count up from that date and you get 1798 again. And then 1799 when he's removed. And this begins now the beginning of the time of the end, which would be a period of 115 years, according to the original calculation. 1290 days is simply taken from that, and we get to 1826, which starts us in the Millerite movement. And I guess a lot of people are aware of, but not too many, is that Jehovah's Witness chronology is very Millerite friendly. They very much saw God's hand in the Millerite movement. And so it appears here in 1826 as the end of the 1290 days, and at the end of 2300 days, which they counted to 1846, which was, again, having to do with the Millerite movement. So the original chronology, the Millerites figured in both at the 1290 and the 2300 days. Then we move up to 1872 with the end of 6,000 years. And this was thought to be, of course, the millennial dawn. That's why the book was called The Millennial Dawn. And although, again, you might see different numbers, 1873, some line it up with 1874. But if you look at the Timeless Handbook, it says 1872. The millennium had begun, and it was benefiting mankind through inventions. And in fact, in some ways, they had this from 1799. But again, from 1872, they would use the same type of reasoning. Like, look at all these inventions that, make it easier for the man working. He's not so cursed anymore. And this is how they incorporated it into their viewpoint, is this millennial was dawning, and that these inventions that made life easier, and the laws that made, the work hours, these were all part of the millennial dawning, and this was all evidence. So that was the end of the 6,000 years, which would figure prominently in the 1975 fiasco, which many ex-Jehovah's Witnesses lived through and can testify. So now we have the end of 6,000 years. That's 1872. Then we get to 1874. If you have more than one land on the date, it's extra proof. It's extra proof. How can anyone deny it? So then they have the 1,335 days of Daniel, end in 1874. And then they have something called the Jubilee, Earth Great Jubilee, 50 times 50. And that's a period of 2,500 years. And they started at a point, of course, that's going to line up nicely. Had something to do with Jacob. And then you count from there and you get 1874. Oh, and there's, of course, the times of restitution have begun. And then you have Israel's double, which was a period of 1,845 years. Of course, they pick a point, and you end up in 1878. So those are the main prophetic ideas and numbers, right? 1799, 1826, 1846, 1872, 73, depending on how you want to start it. 1874, the big one. It's got Earth's Jubilee and the 1335. Then you have Israel's double, which is the 1845. And then, remember, you have the last one, of course, would be the Gentile times 1914. That would start in 606, of course. Remember, witnesses for decades. I got the math wrong. And wait until I show you a letter P.S.L. Johnson wrote. He was a pilgrim of the society. He wrote to Russell before telling him, you got the math wrong. And I'm going to share that with you in another episode. Nonetheless, 2,520 years, as they say, would end in 1914. Now, that was the farthest extent, and all these other things were supposed to happen originally first in 1878. Then they spiritualized it. 1881, spiritualized it. And then the 40-year harvest, they thought would be like parallelisms, right? So if it was 40 years, and it kind of matched up. You see? It's all science. It matches up. 1874, 1914, that's 40 years. 33 to 70, whatever it is, that's 40 years. See? It can't be a coincidence. This is showing us a solid faith that we can put our faith in. And then they had a bunch of parallelisms. So from 74 to 78, also, they had a parallelism. And then from 78 to 81, they had another parallelism. And so that would include things in 78, Christ coming in kingdom power, called to come out of Babylon the Great, the sleeping anointed, the sleeping saints would have a resurrection. 1881 was the shut door, the end of the high calling. And I tell you, the witnesses and the Adventists have shut that door so many times, it's fallen off its hinges. The thing, it keeps shutting and opening, shutting and open. And remember, it shut in 1935. Now it's open again. There's now 20,000 claiming to be God's anointed Christian brothers in the last days. And on it goes. Same mistakes. Definition of insanity. Doing the same thing over or believing the same thing over and expecting a different result. You're not going to get a different result. It's flawed reasoning. There's no secret code in the Bible that you're going to be able to decipher. And certainly, even if you did, it wouldn't be necessary for salvation. Salvation, as we talk in our biblical discussions, was presented in the first century, and it's the same salvation throughout all the centuries. Okay, so let's do a final review of the original chronology presented by Russell that he got from Barber, who got it from the Millerites, who got it from others. That we'll go into detail later. We got 1799 as the start of the last days, 115 years ending in 1914. We got 1826, 1846 with the Millerite movement, also dealing with Daniel's prophecies, the 1260, 1290, and the 2300. Then we get to the end of 6,000 years, 1872, which is the millennial dawn, and everything is going to get better, right? It's going to be the beginning part of the millennium. Then you have 1874, Christ's parousia, Earth's Great Jubilee, the time of restitution. And from there you have Israel's double in 1878, which they calculated. Then they used parallelisms to sort of define what was happening. We have 1874, the parousia, so Jesus comes invisibly into our atmosphere, though, remember? In the vicinity of Earth, invisibly. He comes in kingdom power in 1878, 3 years later. And then 3.5 years later, it's the end of the high calling. And then 40 years later is a time of harvest. And at that part, if you look at the video we did on the 7 things expected in 1914, they expected those things to happen. Now, when the movement first started, they did not expect it to last till 1914. They expected it to last till 1878. That was the first official failure. Russell was not part of the movement that predicted 1874. He accepted its chronology, but was not part of the movement. He joined the movement in 1876, and for a small time of the window being opened, they were preaching 1878, spiritualized it, preached 1881, spiritualized it, and then again had a whole chronology that didn't go all the way to 1914. They were expecting it way before, and they began to hedge their bets. Once it got closer, it became definitive. In fact, they started talking about 1914, 1915 because they realized the math was wrong. I'll share a letter I have from P.S.L. Johnson, a pilgrim, prominent pilgrim, that started the layman home missionary movement of Bible students after, very prominent friend of Russell's, that wrote to Russell telling him that the math was wrong. Okay, so that was the original chronology in a nutshell. And in future video, we're going to show how the Millerites used those prophetic numbers and time periods like the Gentile times and Earth's Jubilee and all that stuff. They used that stuff too. And then how Rutherford took a few of the ideas like the parallelisms, but basically dropped most everything after 1925. He used the Jubilee once to try to get 1925. They did keep 1874 for quite a while, but it lost its importance. And eventually the parousia, the time of the end, the call of Babylon, the fall of Babylon, the end of the high calling was all moved up to Rutherford's time period from 1914 to 1918, 1919, and so forth. So hopefully we made chronology easy and simple. And it's really, I think, those 9 things you got to remember. And then becoming familiar with those terms will help in future when we talk about chronology. So remember 1260, 1290, 1335, 2300, times of the Gentiles, Earth's Great Jubilee, Israel's double. And that's kind of, the big ones, and the end of 6,000 years. So thanks for joining me. We'll have lots more. We'll do detailed sources of where it came from, and we'll use the Bible to show there is no secret code for us to be able to find the end. It is a definition of insanity, constantly doing the same thing and expecting a different result, but doing it with the idea of a day for a year. And we'll see you next time on Beyond the Things Written.